Hey, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we've got a very brief patch to our unrestricted cube, so expect this video to be a bit on the shorter side. As with the Peasant Cube, we wanted to start playing with some of the Historic Anthology cards we just got access to, and we didn't want to wait for Strixhaven to come out to try them. In addition, we're removing 2 cards from the list that have been causing problems, which we'll discuss when we get to them. Before we go over the changes, remember to subscribe to the channel for more content like this and come join our Discord community to try out a draft for yourself. Links are in the description below. Okay, not much to talk about today, so let's go ahead and get to it. We can mimic pretty much everything we said about Thraben Inspector already with the Peasant update, and we expect it to play out just as well in the Unrestricted Cube. In fact, it's likely even better in a more powered up environment, since Thraben Inspector is the perfect creature to curve into your Anthem effects for white beatdown decks, and it's a great body to have lying around for the white Aristocrats decks. Once again, though, cut in one of our functional Savannah Lions is a tough call, since the 1 mana 2/1 body is the hallmark of what makes white weenie decks tick, but even those decks can make use of the good old Inspector. Seriously, if you haven't played with Thraben Inspector and it doesn't look as exciting as I've been hyping it up to be, give it a try. Remember, you invested 1 mana into the creature, and you eventually get your card back. That's about as high of a floor as you can ask for on your 1-drop. The only other monocolored card in this patch is Declaration in Stone, which will replace Seal Away. Deck in Stone is a sweet card. It gives white permanent, unconditional creature removal, which it kind of doesn't have. Almost all of white's single target removal comes in the form of enchantments or temporary exile effects, which can backfire at times. In exchange for just cleanly answering your opponent's creature for only 2 mana, you give them a clue token, but if you're being proactive, you can capitalize on your removal spell by pressuring the opponent and making it hard for them to afford the tempo loss of paying 2 mana to actually use the clue. And that's the key with Declaration in Stone, being proactive. Deck in Stone is a fair bit worse than Seal Away in a control deck. Not that you wouldn't play it still, but holding up Seal Away at instant speed is a big deal, and giving your opponent extra cards when you're playing a control deck isn't great either. However, if you're being aggressive and jamming into the opponent, Declaration in Stone is the perfect removal spell to clear a blocker and keep the pressure on. White control decks already have plenty of tools for removing creatures between sweepers and banish and light type effects, so we're switching up one of those slots for a removal spell that's optimized for white aggro decks. You might remember a while back that we honed in on the Izzet Guild and tried to focus on the spellcasting nature of the color pair as a way to bolster its playability. We added a Lutri to the cube as an incentive to draft Izzet and get a free companion that doubles up a good spell in your deck. While Lutri is theoretically capable of doing just that, the little otter didn't behave itself, and it ended up in literally any deck that even thought it would be capable of producing blue or red mana. In Ikoria Limited, you had to make concessions to play Lutri. Namely, you'd have to give up extra copies of powerful cards if you wanted to companion Lutri. But in a singleton format, there is absolutely zero concessions to be made in order to companion it, and therefore, it was a high pick for practically any red or blue deck, whether you really cared about it or not. Lutri's a good card even if you realistically only have 1 target in your entire deck for it, and as such, we saw Lutri popping up in every deck imaginable. In other words, we planted a card in our Izzet section to intentionally bolster that guild, and instead we ended up just rewarding anyone who was red or blue, not necessarily both. It became a little too ubiquitous a little too quickly, and it didn't solve the problem we included it for in the first place, so Lutri's coming out, likely never to come back in. Instead, we're trying out Goblin Electromancer. It's functionally a second copy of Baral, and the mana reduction ability on spells has proven to be a key component of making Izzet tempo decks work, while also naturally being good in late game control decks. Electromancer is not flashy, but it's respectable, and we didn't want to overthink our Izzet section too soon, given that Strixhaven will have a focused blue-red archetype that will likely give us some new tools anyway. The other problematic card that we're pulling from the list is Essica, or rather the Prismatic Bridge. Jadelight Ranger came back in, and we weren't happy with removing it in the first place, since it's a nice piece of the graveyard decks we're actively trying to boost. It felt like a clean swap. But the real problem here was Essica, which has actually taught us a valuable lesson. It seems clear to me that if you include flashy, awesome 4 or 5 color cards in your cube list, people will want to play them. I mean, duh, right? That's the point of including them. And we're not saying that that's a bad thing to do. In fact, I'm one of those players myself who loves playing multicolored decks with tons of fixin' and insane finishers. Here's the problem. When you draft a card like the Prismatic Bridge, what do you want to fill your deck with? Mostly mana fixin' and big multicolored finishers, which tend to be the more powerful permanents you can get. Cards like this lead you to take tons and tons of mana fixin', and the more you take, the less everyone else gets. We've seen multiple drafts where Boros aggro players, for example, can't get a hold of any mana fixin' because the Prismatic Bridge deck is snapping off any land it can get its hands on, and that's a big deal for decks that rely on mana fixin' lands for consistency. It's fun to be in the Wooburg player's shoes. It's less fun for the other 7 drafters whose decks aren't getting their key pieces because of it. Include in Essica pushed our multicolored decks a smidge over the edge and added one too many cards to the pile of multicolor payoffs that we're comfortable playing. Field of the Dead, Omnath, and Golos all incentivize mana-hungry multicolored decks, and Essica being tossed in the mix made it such that you'd often end up with 2 multicolored drafters at the table, and the responsible dual-color decks suffered because of it. It's a lesson learned for sure, and we'll be a bit more cautious with how we approach multicolored cards moving forward. The remaining 4 changes are all colorless cards from the new Historic Anthology, with the first being Bone Splitter. Now, full disclosure, we're probably trimming a lot of the experimental Boros equipment stuff we included recently in our next main update, but for now, Bone Splitter should excel alongside those cards. I already harped on Bone Splitter in the Peasant video, and even without considering the Boros equipment deck, we think it's still a fantastic piece of colorless equipment. The bottom line is that it turns anything into a threat that can't be ignored, and it's so cheap to get going that the play pattern of equipping, attacking, re-equipping, blocking, equipping, and attacking again next turn is going to be a common line of play. It's a boon to our aggressive decks, and we're happy to trim Lithoform Engine for it. Cool card for sure, but a bit too cutesy and mana hungry to be a card that people should actually want in their draft pile. We're going to take another note from the Peasant Cube with Cold Steel Heart, a tapped mana accelerant that asks you to lock in a color when it comes into play. There's plenty of green-based ramp in the cube, but not much efficient colorless ramp, and Cold Steel Heart is another piece of cheap acceleration and mana fixin' for decks that want it. The cut here was Throne of the God Pharaoh. We can firmly place this card in the undesirable camp for now. There are certain ways to essentially combo with this card, namely with Mana Dorks, Convoke cards, or vehicles, but it asks you to have a real board presence and a way of tapping creatures down to make it useful, all while doing straight nothing when you're behind. It's good some small percentage of the time, but it's sideboard fodder significantly more often, and we're glad to cut it for something that will definitely see play. Blinkmoth Nexus isn't the most explosive card for our list, but it's a respectable utility land that we can envision aggro decks wanting. Arch of Araska reads well on paper as a way to gain some advantage in a stalled out game or in a heavy control deck, but neither Chris nor myself can recall ever having seen the land be activated, and we're not in the market for ascending just for the sake of saying we've got the city's blessing. We're noticing a theme with our colorless utility lands. They don't get drafted highly, and they don't get activated often. We could probably dive pretty deep on why that might be the case, but we think it boils down to the way matches play out in this cube. People are almost always doing something on their turn, and almost all decks can put pressure on people. Board stalls don't happen often, so there's not a lot of time to dump mana into activated abilities that don't impact the board. The person lands like Crawlin' Barrens and Blinkmoth Nexus can function as creatures, and cards like Blast Zone can function as removal, but Arch of Araska is expensive and doesn't impact the board, so it doesn't get activated much. Again, another note on new utility lands moving forward. Alright, I saved Sword of Body and Mind for last because up to this point, it's been perhaps the most controversial card as far as Chris's and my own separate opinions are concerned. Real quick, Forebear's Blade was cut to make room, but you didn't come here to hear about that. The card's clunky and you get blown out too often. We nixed it for this piece of work instead, so let's get back to it. To be transparent, I believe this card is a mistake to add to the list, as it compromises some of our core philosophies, namely the idea that we want players to do powerful things, but in the most fun and interactive way possible. Sword of Body and Mind, or any of these swords for that matter, cut off a significant amount of interaction that could deal with them, and when left unopposed, any creature deck playing this card will just win in a couple of hits. The part that bothers me specifically is that it's a colorless card with no downside. Any deck can play it, any creature can be equipped, all while cutting off many of the avenues a player would have to take to not lose to it. Now, on the other side of the coin, there are some legitimate reasons for trying it out. The main reason is that it's a powerful colorless card in a section that still has some filler cards that people just aren't playing. If we have the chance to replace some undesirable cards with something we know will see a lot of play, we should consider that. Second, and more importantly, you can still interact with the sword itself, and if you're not playing a green or blue deck, you have plenty of other ways to interact with the equipped creature through normal means. Our community seems to back this point, that it won't be the end of the world to at least test the card out and see what happens. The combination of being colorless, providing double protection, and being fairly reasonable to cast and equip all combines to make me quite weary of the times that this will just cut off a player from being able to interact, but I might be blowing that out of proportion. It's going to have its time in the sun, and if it proves to be too good for our environment, we've committed to removing it. But for now, sword away. I'd love to hear people's take on this card, so let's hear it in the comments. Alright, that's it for this one. We only went over 8 changes to the list, but we want these patches to be on the shorter side. We're reserving patches for supplementary sets that drop on Arena, or for when we want to remove problematic cards without waiting for the next standard set to release. We're still going to stick to the main set updates and mid-season updates, but expect to see some patches from time to time. That being said, I also thought it would be useful to spell out why we removed Essica and Lutri, since we learned some pretty valuable lessons from playing with those cards. At any rate, that's it for this patch. We'll likely see everyone again for Strixhaven update in about a month, so let's get some more reps in for the Kaldheim season. As always, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and find the link to our Discord community in the description below. Thanks for hanging out. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I'll see you next time.